Hey guys, how's it going? I'm here to talk about the next part of the Silmarillion that Elena Macredina and I have read. This is chapters 14 through 17, I believe. I may have gotten that wrong. But I got the last week's chapters wrong too. But anyway, this section that we read, it has my absolute least favorite chapter in the entire Silmarillion. It's this chapter called Of Beleriand and Its Realms. So Beleriand is the land that this is all taking place in Middle-earth. And it's basically just a long description of the geography of these lands in Beleriand, and who lives where, and who rules over what, and which groups of elves live where, and to me, I don't really get why it's there, aside from maybe describing where each group of elves lives, but I don't get why you can't just summarize that in one paragraph at the end of a chapter or the beginning of a chapter, rather than devoting an entire chapter to it, because this, for me, is just such a boring chapter, and a lot of my rereads, I've just skipped it. Because, why do we have a map if we have this whole chapter describing geography? And descriptions in words of geography and physical landscapes, or even physical people, have always not really worked for me. I need a visual aid. So I would have preferred just a map with, like, here are where so-and-so live, here's where so-and-so live, and things like that. But anyway, and what's also frustrating about it is at that point where you get to that chapter, you're just starting to get some interesting stories going on. Elena described some cool stories that are going on in her video, and those are just starting to happen, and then you hit this wall of this chapter, and it's just been such a mystery to me why it's here, and it's like a chunk that I hate within a book that I absolutely love. That chapter, I had to spill my feelings about it. Anyway, we do get story here, obviously. That's just one chapter. And what's kind of interesting to me is that there's a story of an elf named Aradel, who is the sister of Turgon, who is the king of the city of Gondolin, which is a city that is this magnificent city that's hidden in a sort of mountain valley in Beleriand, so no one knows about it except for the people who live in Gondolin. And so Turgon doesn't want anyone to leave Gondolin, because he doesn't want anyone to find out about it, because he doesn't want it to be destroyed. But Aradel lives there, and she's kind of restless. She wants to explore the world. So she convinces Turgon to let her go, telling him that she'll be careful, of course. And then she goes forth and kind of gets lost in the wilderness and meets this strange elf who kind of lives apart from most other elves. And that story is interesting because it seems to kind of... so that elf she meets, Eol, forces her to marry him, for one thing. So it kind of explores sexual predation, in a sense, almost. And also, they have a son together. And her son seems like... kind of one of those examples of a person who turns out bad. He kind of ends up becoming a not-so-nice guy, but he also has a really unfortunate childhood. Like, you can already see it in the, dynamic between his parents. His mother doesn't like his father very much. His father's not a very nice guy. That whole story, I want to try to avoid spoilers from here on out. That whole story doesn't end well for his parents. And so you have to think this guy who... And he's relatively young when all this takes place. I mean, he must be a teenager or in his early 20s, which I guess maybe for an elf is maturity-wise a bit older than a human, but I'm not really sure how elves mature. And you have to think, he's sort of a lost soul. Because he also has this whole affair with unrequited love with a woman he meets, and she doesn't like him. In fact, it's implied that she kind of is revolted by him almost, and so that makes him very resentful. And so all these things happen in his life that are just kind of unfortunate for him. And then he ends up becoming kind of not a great guy later on in the Silmarillion. And it's kind of one of those dilemmas, like, to what extent does the unfortunate things that have happened in a person's life, extenuate what bad things they end up doing? I don't remember specifically what Maiglin does that ends up turning him into a bad guy, which my memory will presumably be refreshed when I read it. But he does, and so that's interesting. And then the other thing of note that I just have jotted down here is, in this section in particular, there were a lot of powerful women, powerful and intelligent women who, take the initiative and at times are more competent than the men around them. So there's Galadriel, who many will know from The Lord of the Rings, who has come to Middle-earth because she wants to found a realm of her own. And she kind of becomes friends with Melian, who is the Maya, who is the queen of Doriath. And they have this conversation about, the fate of the Noldor and what will happen to them and what they've done and these sorts of things. And it also, later in the Silmarillion, Galadriel, Melian kind of becomes Galadriel's mentor, in a sense. And it was just interesting to see these two women essentially talking about, these giant historical events, with this prophetic air and intelligently, and fantasy, the genre of fantasy has always had kind of a problem with female characters, and Tolkien is kind of considered the one to have started it, because his female characters in The Lord of the Rings, in terms of how they represent women, are pretty old-fashioned. I want to say patriarchal, but here we have some more women, like Galadriel and Melian, who are intelligent, and then we also have Aredhel, who takes the initiative and goes forth on her own, doesn't care what the man in her life says, and it does kind of lead to misfortune for her, but then she and her son get herself out of that situation too. And then there's Haleth, who is a human woman, who is actually one of the great leaders of humans when they first come into Beleriand. And she's honored by her people, she's honored by the elves, and, she makes mistakes. She leads her people through a very difficult passage in Beleriand, like a mountain pass of some sort, and a lot of them die. So she's not perfect, but she is a powerful woman, and she is honored. So I just think it's, even though these women play a smaller part, certainly, than the men in this story, it's cool to have them here, especially since Tolkien's representation of women in The Lord of the Rings isn't as stellar. So those are my two main notes from this section. For next week, we're going to get into one of the best stories in the Silmarillion. It's the story of Beren and Luthien, which many of you may have heard of, sorry. So I'm pretty excited to reread that one. That's a good story. And then the week after that, we have the story of Turin Turambar, which is my absolute favorite story from the Tolkien canon, essentially. So, the next 2 weeks are going to be heavy hitters, and, anyway, so, that is what I have. So, thanks, guys. Bye!